Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the webinar and the official launch of the State of the Economy report published by the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka. Thank you very much for joining us here today. Unfortunately, due to the prevailing conditions in the country and around the world, a traditionally physical event is taking place digitally. The benefits of this is that we have people from all over the world joining in us today during this live discussion. And we have an eminent panel to discuss the state of the economy of Sri Lanka as well. A panel that doesn't need much introduction, except I would say that names and their titles, and then we can move on directly to the discussion. So today's panel consists of Dr. Dushni Weerakoon, Executive Director of IPS, Mr. Fernando, CEO of Dilmah Tea, Dr. Nisha Arunatilake, Director of Research of IPS, and my name is Kithmina Hewage. Before we move on, I would like to remind you that if you have any questions for us, please log on to slido.com, that is SLIDO.com, and enter the code 85404 and send in any questions that you have. I will integrate your questions into our discussion here today during the next hour. Pandemics and disruptions, reviving Sri Lanka's economy. That is the title of this year's IPS State of the Economy report. Dr. Dushni, let me move to you on our first question. Because when we talk about reviving the economy, we also need to take a look at what the macroeconomic conditions in the country right now are. How would you assess Sri Lanka's current macroeconomic conditions? And what do you think the current biggest challenges are in terms of that?
Thank you, Kithmina. I think, as you said, the preoccupation today is with the macroeconomic situation in Sri Lanka. And the number one priority, one that is discussed almost every day, is the country's public debt situation. That is not something that crept up on us overnight. It has been building up progressively over the last decade. It's unfortunate that a shock like COVID-19 simply makes matters that much more challenging. So in terms of the fallout of COVID-19 on the debt sustainability and the broader macro conditions, to me, I see two related developments. One is that because of this large debt overhang, we are not able to implement economic mitigation or economic stimulus package of a size that perhaps would have been preferred by the government, given the scale and complexity of the current crisis, because there are ever-present risks. For instance, if we see a weakening on the fiscal side, there can be a sovereign ratings reassessment, and if that goes against Sri Lanka, the cost of rolling over our foreign debt goes up, and our future debt resettlement burden becomes that much bigger. Similarly, on the monetary policy front, even as we inject liquidity to support firms and businesses, we have to be mindful that these do have impacts on, for instance, on the exchange rate. If at some point we have a sharp, sudden devaluation of the currency, that again leads to a automatic expansion and a sizable expansion of our debt, given the that foreign currency denominated debt is so high. The second fallout, and related to these pressures that I see, is again that because of the foreign exchange pressures and the need to revive growth as a result of COVID-19, we might be predisposed to encourage FDI to come into sectors like construction and into real estate. It's easier to draw FDI into these sectors to ease our forex pressures right now. Understandable, again, given the context in which we are in. But beyond the recovery phase, I think Sri Lanka needs to look at a more sustained growth strategy and a growth path for us that is built on productivity-driven growth with technology infusion. That is what will deliver better jobs and better standards of living as we move to being an upper middle income country in the next year or two.
Dilhan, let me bring you in here because Dr. Dushni just mentioned that our macroeconomic situation, particularly in regards to debt as well as our fiscal deficits, is something that we have seen coming for quite a while. And unfortunately, the current pandemic has exacerbated the pressures on our macroeconomic fundamentals. From a private sector perspective, as someone who heads, I would say, multinational company as such, and also a key contributor to the export revenue of the country, what has been the impact of our macroeconomic fundamentals on the private sector?
I think it's what COVID and the combination of this, I guess the toxic combination of fiscal and macroeconomic issues have done is that it has underlined certain, as someone said, pre-existing conditions in a medical context, and the same applies in an economic context. It's simply the fact that, as you have stated in the State of the Economy at the bottom, in the conclusion, sustained recovery for the poor means reviving livelihoods and generating employment opportunities across the country. Now, the poor are the most significantly affected by the current situation. And I think it leads to a fundamental change in the social, economic, and environmental role of businesses. So I think we have seen very tellingly that there is a role for business beyond that conventional economic value. I think LSE's professor, I think it was Mariana Mazzucato, who talks a lot about social value and natural value. And look at what we have experienced in the past few months. We have seen value ascribed to things that we have always thought of as costs. So as a private sector entity, understanding in very clear, with great clarity, that education, the teachers, they're not a cost, they're an incredible value. Understanding that healthcare, my gosh, that is the survival of our business, it is the survival of our consumer, it is the survival of our country. And so I think what we are seeing here is a total reassessment of our value system, but also what COVID has done is it has exposed certain structural weaknesses that have contributed to this macroeconomic or these macroeconomic weaknesses. So, I mean, ultimately, I think we need to consider that the social value, environmental value, which we are suffering from today, if you look at what's happening in terms of transmission in some countries like India, even here, inequality is exacerbating the situation. Extreme climate events are increased and are also creating issues. So I think what we have seen in the past months is a demonstration with incredible clarity of our interconnectedness, and its impact upon the private sector is a critical need for us to collaborate, for us to pool resources. We are not going to find solutions to some of the problems that we are faced with today if we adopt a pre-COVID or maybe a 2018-19 era competitive alignment. I mean, that applies internationally as well. But I think those are the things. It's about collaboration, a fresh collaboration with government, with academia, with people like yourselves, with science, but also amongst each other, and a new value system where we bring into our value and into our creation of this concept of creation of value, not simply the one-dimensional creation of commercial or economic value, but also the social and the environmental aspects.
Up a little bit on that. Have you seen any private sector moves towards this sort of collaboration over the past 6 months or so in Sri Lanka?
Absolutely. I mean, there have been so many instances where simple things like businesses sharing dry rations, businesses opening up their resources. I mean, I've seen free internet connections. I mean, you've seen that. I mean, one of the things that COVID has exposed is the digital divide. Yeah? And because we've seen the importance. I mean, remote working is here to stay. So possibly, to an extent, is remote or virtual education. And in that situation, you see inequality enhanced by the fact that lots of people don't have access to the kind of technologies that we take for granted. And so we've seen corporates, I mean, people at every level. In our case, of course, our business is founded on a philosophy of making business a matter of human service. But beyond that, what is important today, and I think what the difference that we are seeing today is the fact that there needs to be greater sincerity towards the impact of CSR. We had this concept earlier of CSR, which was as much a marketing concept as anything else. And so today, I think we have realized through this interconnectedness and the rapid development of the pandemic around the world, we have also seen the social, environmental, and other interconnectedness of our global community. And I think with that comes a realization with really no arguments on any side that we're all in the same boat. So we better pool our resources. We better put our heads together, whether you're science, education, government, and it redefines our roles. We need to take it seriously. And I think today it's much more about the sincerity of those actions and much less about showing the consumer and putting up a visually appealing CSR program.
Dr. Nisha, let me come to you on this, because at the outset of this pandemic, a lot of people were saying, everyone gets the virus equally, it's a great leveler and things like that. But that's not true. The poor and vulnerable have been affected by COVID-19 disproportionately more than the middle class and upper class, both in Sri Lanka as well as around the world. Particularly if you look at the second wave of the most recent cluster in Sri Lanka, it's the blue collar workers that seem to be getting infected most often. What was Sri Lanka's position in terms of inequality before COVID-19, and how has it exacerbated inequalities in Sri Lanka and in terms of the economy? Dr. Nisha, if you can unmute.
Thank you, Kithmina, for that question. Yes, the inequality, I think, exacerbated quite a bit. As you very correctly said, the poor and the vulnerable are more affected by the pandemic because of the locations where they live in, overcrowded places, and the type of work that they do, again, overcrowded factories, or they use public transport. So this is not really unique to Sri Lanka. Everywhere this has been the case. And it has created a very serious economic slowdown. What is unique to Sri Lanka, and this is particularly due to the macro challenges that we spoke about, is the response, the size of the government response to provide relief to these workers. Now, if you look at the response in Sri Lanka, it was 0.25% of GDP. But if you compare that with even low middle income countries like Vietnam, where the relief package was 3.6% of GDP, or even Indonesia, which has a 7% of GDP, and even upper middle income countries, Thailand had 9.6% of GDP. So this is where that what we have done, I feel, is not enough. It's quite comprehensive. It included price controls and transfers given to the most vulnerable, and relief on loan payments, and all of these. In terms of the types of activities, it was quite comprehensive. But what was lacking was the size of it. Now, what happens is when it is not enough, people go to different types of coping mechanisms. They might run down their savings, or they might sell their assets. And most importantly, they might not invest in education and health, which could have quite long-term impact on human development of the country and productivity and growth of the future of Sri Lanka. So it is why it is very important at this particular juncture, because consumption is down, investments are low, trade is not happening. Only thing that could stimulate growth is government expenditure. But it's to the extent what the country can do at the moment is challenged because of the macro condition. So this is exactly why it is very important for the country to have macro stability. So periods of this, when there is a disaster, that we can cope with it better.
Right. So let me now move on to solutions, because I think we've all kind of touched on what the broader context of the macroeconomic fundamentals are, as to what sort of challenges we are facing in Sri Lanka. And the IPS State of the Economy report as well spends a lot more time on trying to discuss solutions as to how the economy can recover, in addition to kind of setting the stage as to why we are in the situation that we are. Dr. Dushni, let me come to you next, because Dr. Nisha also just alluded to it, that we need more government spending to try and help the country revive its economic growth. But as you mentioned earlier, we are also facing a fiscal deficit. We are also facing external debt. What can the government do to balance these competing interests? So on one side, you need more government spending, and on the other side, you need to be much more fiscally responsible and fiscally conservative.
Yes, Kithmina, I mean, it's when you look at the initial stimulus packages that were rolled out, you can see certain commonalities in many of the interventions that countries around the world implemented. It is in the recovery phase that you expect to see more country-specific fiscal supported spending being implemented to accelerate that recovery process. So for instance, I will say that one easy and quick means of recovery through fiscal support is in infrastructure. And in fact, the IMF, I think, recently came out and urged governments to spend. But as we've, there's no need to repeat, but we are in this tight situation of having to maintain some credible medium-term fiscal path because of the debt overhang that we have. So in that context, I think what we can do is to try and attract some amount of foreign investments or foreign direct investments into sectors that can jumpstart that recovery process. And again, sector like construction is one that comes to mind, because that is where workers are in some sense isolated. They're working in the open, and these are workers that do need employment, because they are the ones that suffer when we have a shutdown. Now, Sri Lanka can do that, and that's what I alluded to earlier, that is the recovery path for us, strains that we face. But we have to be mindful to regard it as a temporary recovery strategy, and not lean on it in the more sort of post-recovery phase to be the main driver of growth. Because we must keep in mind, as it's well known, Sri Lanka is a aging economy. Our labor force is shrinking. We have to focus on skills, on technology, on productivity, and focusing on construction to drive growth, as we may have done about a decade ago, is no longer going to be sort of a relevant option in the medium to long term.
So one of the policy decisions that have been taken, and we've got a lot of questions on this as well, is in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the pressures on the local currency. We have seen increasing import restrictions, and there is a heavy emphasis on import substitution to try and drive economic growth in Sri Lanka. How, in the long term, how sustainable is this as a policy, or is this effective in driving that growth? Dr. Dushni, you're on mute.
Sri Lanka is not the only country that's rethinking its trade policy. It's been on the cards since the global financial crisis. We've seen a pushback against globalization, and COVID-19, I think, is accelerating that process. the priority for countries now is to provide employment, provide jobs, and there is, I think, a sense that if we protect our industries, give them a period in which, relief period in which to recover, then the economy will be better situated to face the much harder long-term sort of, sustainable growth process that we have to put in place. So in that context, I see that this is an unprecedented economic shock. We have no idea as yet what is the scale of the crisis on the Sri Lankan economy. We are yet to see the second quarter GDP growth rates that will capture in absolute terms what has really happened. So we are all working in the dark. And I think to that extent, it's understandable that a temporary period in which a certain degree of import protection is offered and efforts are made to encourage domestic production. Again, I would see the sensible option is to view this as emergency measures that once the economy starts to recover, we have to rethink, because there are other developments taking place in the global economy. Value chains have been disrupted, but they are restructuring and reorganizing and coming back in more sort of compact forms. China will be at the forefront of some of these value chain networks in the Asian region, and Sri Lanka cannot afford to miss out by holding on to unwieldy tariff regimes or other protectionist measures in key sectors that we want to ensure that we break into international markets, etc. So for those, if you want to join into global or regional production structures, you need a seamless sort of tariff regime for entry and exit of raw materials, intermediate goods, and final goods. So I would say, look at these as temporary emergency measures, but once we see a recovery taking shape, we must rethink about other ways and means of directly addressing any external sector pressures that the country faces.
Dilhan, let me throw kind of on similar veins. These import restrictions, and there has been an increase in inflation as well. How has it affected your sector, and has it affected at all, or are you one of those sectors that is not affected and you can continue? And broadly from the private sector perspective, how do you weigh these sort of import restrictions, at least on a temporary basis?
Kithmina, well, the bottom line is, as you have stated in the report, building back better means building better livelihoods. And therefore, I think the import restrictions are absolutely critical, simply to ensure the survival of our country economically. But beyond that, it's also going to give us an important boost to certain sectors. But I think that with that opportunity, there is a necessity to build certain areas that are lacking. There are structural deficiencies in terms of innovation, in terms of access to seed. I mean, the core areas you have highlighted, I mean, clearly construction, tourism, agriculture, and fisheries. So if you really look at building the base of our economy, we need to be able to address the farmers' issues, supply chain issues. We need to be able to address seed issues. We need to be able to look at better technology. We need to be able to help with climate adaptation and so on. The point is that all those skills exist in this country, and you can see in your report itself that many of the solutions are the problems are diagnosed and the solutions are evident. They're available in this nation. We simply need to build a new paradigm for collaboration, to bring in academia and to really change their role so that there can be active contribution. If you look at, I mean, beyond that, looking at the tea sector, I would say, yes, we've made a very substantial change by moving from a physical auction to a digital one. But beyond that, we need to also look on how we adapt these technologies to meet what the market is demanding. The market today is demanding traceability, is demanding much greater accountability in terms of ethics, sustainability, and so also, of course, the environment. And so we need to be able to merge all of this. And again, the technologies are available. It's simply a question of helping plantation companies which might not have the necessary capability. It's about building a strong national capability for driving adoption of technologies and to help businesses do so. But it also probably means working with some businesses that have been able to refine that process, because I think, I mean, as I was saying, the role of business changes. And in doing so, we have to look at business, you know, when you say a business with a purpose, and I think that was mentioned earlier, it has to be sincerely a purpose beyond profit. And that means that a business has to now begin to embrace social, environmental, and other obligations where profit becomes a byproduct in a sense. And I think that's something that we are seeing now. And if companies don't realize it, the consumer will make sure that they dictate that requirement fairly clearly.
Dilhan, I think, I mean, now if you speak to a small and medium-sized enterprise, a lot of the SME sector has been complaining about some import restrictions because it increases their cost of production and it reduces their profitability. In terms of that, in terms of the collaboration that you also talk about, how is it that we can represent SME interests a lot more in the policymaking process and the economic policy process in the broader scheme?
We have a fantastic agricultural capability. We have highly trained agrarian services entity. We simply need to be able to streamline the interface of that capability and the beneficiaries, the intended beneficiaries. But also there is a critical requirement beyond technology that will help us to unlock the potential at a production level and a supply chain level to reduce wastage and so on. There also a critical requirement to build market alignment, because I think this is something that many of the producers suffer from, because lacking market alignment, they simply don't get the right price for their goods, and therefore there is a middleman that is profiting. I mean, to be looking at our story, that is the entire crux of the Dilmah story, cutting out the middleman. And this needs to be done in order to unlock the potential in the rural economy. Whether you look at curd or rice or whatever you category you look at, there is incredible potential. Spices, tea, jackfruit, you know, all of these. I don't need to tell you those, but we need a combination of the supply side, the production side, as well as the supply, as well as the demand side, the market alignment, in order to be able to address that. And I think, I mean, one of the within the national export strategy, something that has been advocated is a national food authority, which would make it easier for smallholders, micro and small entrepreneurs to access some of the market alignment. That means also national quality infrastructure and so on. So it's not that simple, but the point I'm making is that the competence capability exists in Sri Lanka. We need to build that harmony or that collaboration.
Dr. Nisha, Dilhan spoke about the competence and capability of the workforce. He spoke about the necessity to streamline the economy. All this sounds like something that needs to come through the education system. And unfortunately, what we've seen over the past few months is that it's the education sector that has been affected most, or affected quite a lot because of lockdowns. You know, schools have now moved to at best possible digital platforms. But I think the flip side of this is that inequality again comes through. What is Sri Lanka's current position in terms of its platform to respond to this sort of lockdown, or another lockdown, for example, if it happens?
So Kithmina, before I answer your question, I just want to respond to what Dilhan was talking about. He was talking about the need for traceability, accountability in the companies and environment protection, and for the SMEs to align with global supply chains. Now, all of these need skilled workers. I mean, what I see in Sri Lanka, you know, we have 68% of workers in the informal sector, and only 13% of workers in Sri Lanka are professionals. Whereas in developing countries, we have 50% of workers, professionals. So we need these workers to identify technologies and bring them into different industries so that we can upgrade our production processes and improve efficiencies and make use of new technologies that are coming up. Now, this is where education is so important. And when I'm talking about education, it is not the primary level, lower secondary level, even senior secondary level education that we are talking about. It is the tertiary level education. We need professionals, we need people who have higher diplomas, who have computer technology skills, so that you can bring in these technologies and make use of opportunities that are opening up around the world. I mean, this some of which we discussed in our 2019 State of the Economy. So in this regard, I think what we see, coming back to the question that you asked on education, what Sri Lanka's response towards education, I think we didn't have a sort of an integrated response. It was mainly left for individual schools to come up with means of providing long distance education. The government did come up with some programs to provide education services via television, especially for those children who were sitting their exams this year. But if you look at what the countries around the world were doing, I think they really looked at the quality and the coverage of education services. So they had an integrated approach where they used all kinds of, because as you know, in Sri Lanka, not everybody has access to internet or smartphones or computers. So in some countries, they had an integrated approach where they used television, radio, social media, all of them together to make sure education services went out to all the families, all the households. And also on top of now, when you talk about education, schools do much more than just educate people. Now, about 1 million children in the country are given meals in schools. Now, some countries actually even provided families with assistance with school-going children so that their nutrition levels won't go down because the schools are not functioning. And there was support given to university students. So again, what we see is because of these macro constraints, that the extent to which the country could come up with an integrated strategy to help the households was limited.
But in terms of the core concepts, so particularly we may have, I mean, hopefully we may have a vaccine soon over the next few months. And hopefully that vaccine is available for developing countries like ours soon as well. But if, for example, this situation has to continue for another year, where we have, clusters coming up frequently, schools have to close down, or, you can't have big physical events, then is Sri Lanka prepared for that sort of eventuality in the medium term? And secondly, we had a lull in cases for about 2 or 3 months in Sri Lanka. What has been done during that time for Sri Lanka to prepare for this sort of eventuality if it comes up again, for a second or even a third wave of COVID-19 cases?
What has happened so far is, there were online courses going on, but that mainly happened with the private schools or maybe Colombo-based schools. In the poorer schools, a lot of the teachers just sent out material via SMS. So the onus was on the student to learn on their own. So I think the education wasn't happening to a large extent. So the children are left to their own devices. I think we could probably do much more using television, because when you use television or even social media for that matter, you don't need to have schools teaching their student population. You can, because whole of Sri Lanka, they use the same syllabus. So if if you really think through, you could actually do a better job of delivering education services using available resources that will reach out to all the households. So I really feel that we could do more in terms of providing education.
Dr. Nisha, let me ask you one more question to kind of move this question. In addition to inequality in terms of income, the other big issue that we have in the country that we have flagged across the years and has been exacerbated again is gender inequality. The impact of COVID-19 has disproportionately affected women in the workforce, women in education, and even social protection schemes. Where does Sri Lanka stand in terms of gender inequality and the impact of COVID-19?
Yeah, this has created a lot of issues. I mean, personally for me as well. When you say work from home, it is actually harder for a female because you are trying to juggle your household activities with your work activities. But I think this could actually provide opportunities in future also, because some companies are already thinking about flexible working arrangements and more online work. And so that could create opportunities for females to coming to the labor market, which is a plus thing. But in order for that to happen, you need to have properly skilled females. I mean, very few females, as far as I know, would be doing jobs that can be done from home. As I said earlier, 68% of the workers are informal sector workers. So a lot of them would not probably benefit from these type of work. But I feel that this can provide certain opportunities where you can have females coming in. But in terms of social protection also, because females are not in the labor force, they are not getting the incomes that the males are getting. So there you have a sort of inequality towards females, because they are not having incomes that they are more likely to do vulnerable jobs that they can't continue in a situation like this. So they're more affected. And since they're not covered by social protection, their income sources are dried up. So I think they are more tend to go into poverty and these kind of, yeah.
Dilhan, there are a few questions particular to specific to your sector as well. And kind of moving on from that in regards to gender inequality. Your sector tends to employ a lot of women, the disproportionate, like a majority of women in your sector, estate sector. And there has been a call for increasing the minimum salary of estate sector workers as well. What is your position on that? And is it a possibility to initiate that under the current economic circumstances in the country?
Well, I think, employing a large number of women and whether men or women, there is a significant obligation on the part not only of us, of all the plantation owners, but I think that the core issue we have that is also a part of the definition of a living wage is the fact that we are existing within an extremely oppressive international environment. So when you consider the plight of Ceylon tea, absolutely, of course we should. I mean, we would ideally like to go beyond even the expectations of the unions currently. And I mean, there is a necessity for adjustments. The industry suffers from certain structural issues and they impact housing, etc. So wherever possible, speaking on behalf of our own Kahawatha plantations, wherever possible, we have looked at, of course, upgrading housing, there's partnerships available and so on. But beyond that, ultimately, there are several different dimensions to the definition of a living wage. So at this point, the significant majority in terms of cost of production, labor cost accounts for nearly, well, over 60%. And beyond that, because we operate in a fairly hostile, not fairly, I mean, a very hostile international environment, if you look at some of our customers, some of our retail customers, which are a very necessary part of our business, they would make 40–45% margin. And if our product fails to achieve that, we're out. And so in that situation, us and all Sri Lankan tea producers are in a very difficult situation because, of course, we acknowledge the fact that welfare, not only of labor at any level, not only of people in the tea industry, but beyond that, it's a right, education, etc. But the question is, the money currently is going into the wrong pockets, because you have a product that we export, which is of exceptional quality, and something where the producer themselves gets a disproportionate, unfortunately, a disproportionately low share of the earnings. Absolutely, I think that it would be something, and we have been encouraging the not only the government but other producers to look to branding, to look to direct exports, because that is the only way. Again, it's a question of market alignment. If you look at the cost of production, the net sale average, there is a very thin margin between the cost of production and the export average. So that essentially means that we are forced to export much of the benefit of the tea that we produce. If that can be corrected, and it can only be corrected through value addition, which is a function of marketing, etc., then we have a situation where absolutely we could, we should and could afford much better facilities and wages. But at the moment, Sri Lanka pays significantly higher wages than most producing centers. I mean, if you look at some in our own region, that is the case.
Is this also then a matter of as to where the tea industry is set in the country? So, for example, there is a call for more technology-driven production processes in the tea sector in Sri Lanka. Is that a possibility? Because there have been some arguments that, you know, it's difficult to integrate technology in the tea sector in Sri Lanka because of its gradient and so on.
The tea industry has phenomenal potential, and it is untrue that you cannot integrate technology into the industry. We are trialing ourselves drone-enabled precision agriculture. It's a necessity if we are to have a pool of workers who are highly productive in order to deliver a product that is competitive internationally, that will allow us to be able to return the kind of welfare funds that we would like to. Then we need to ensure that we address some of the inefficiencies. And we have to face it. We have depleted soils relative to most of our competitors. We also have antiquated methods and systems. So, of course, that is possible. Drones are one part of it, but beyond that also is the planting material, research and development, and other forms of innovation. But equally important is marketing innovation, because we have uniqueness in Sri Lanka related to agroclimatic regions, different tastes, flavors, and so on. Communicating this is critically important, because you have a progressive erosion of the image of Ceylon tea. If you look at it over the past 3 to 4 decades, when it was a very prized product and it commanded a significant premium and certain demand. If you look at all, well, not all, but most of our core markets, whether it is the UK or Russia, that position is eroded. So at this point, yes, we can certainly look at greater welfare and greater expenses, but ultimately that could lead to the death of a very important industry with millions of people involved, unless it is accompanied by improvements in productivity, improvements in research development, and the use of technology.
Dr. Dushni, let me come to you, because there is now a kind of chicken and egg story here. Do we kind of wait for the private sector to grow the economy and then kind of push welfare, or should the government, you know, take the charge in terms of providing the sort of welfare that we see, particularly given the impact of COVID-19? There is a budget coming up in a few months in Sri Lanka, in 1.5 months. Does this mean that Sri Lanka may have to increase their taxes and increase revenue, so in order to redirect that revenue into social welfare mechanisms?
My response to the first question, I mean, who takes the lead in providing social welfare? I think that has to be the government. I think in this particular set of circumstances, as Nisha made clear in her response, those who have been impacted by the COVID-19 are the less beloved, the vulnerable workers who have no social protection, and it will take time for their jobs and livelihoods to get back to normal. the expectation is that most countries will see a permanent loss of output, which means even if you recover, it is below the trend line growth that you would have seen if not for COVID. So private sector will also be struggling. And in that context, I think it would be a little unrealistic to think that the private sector will take on the initial burden of trying to ensure some degree of equity, and that will always remain the responsibility of the government. How do we do it? That's the $64 million question. I think that at some point we have to look at our tax and spending policies for sure. On the spending side, certain, I think, creditable efforts have been made to try and contain wasteful expenditures, etc. But I think there's still much more that can be done. But even if you control spending, it's not going to make a huge difference to the kind of fiscal rebalancing that we need to put in place. And that brings us back to revenues, because we need to raise spending on education, on health, on social protection. So even if you control spending, the additional spending needs are mounting at the same time. So on the revenue side, I think, yes, we do have to revisit tax policies at some point, but it cannot be premature, because if once we get into a recovery phase and you suddenly go into a fiscal consolidation process of raising taxes, that's not going to be very helpful. So the phasing in of tax and spending policy reforms over the next 3 years, I think is going to be very critical. It has to be done in a very systematic and methodical way. There's very little room to improvise as we go along. So I assume or hope that the budget that we will see being presented in November is the first step in putting forward that 3-year policy program to bring us to some sort of degree of fiscal stability in the medium term.
There's a lot of debate going on right now, and quite a few questions as well in regards to the options that we have. One is in terms of the sort of foreign aid or the aid that development aid that we may get from different countries. Another is in terms of borrowings from foreign markets as well as bilateral lenders. And then, of course, there is the issue of how we spend that money. Is borrowing a policy option that we should look at? And in terms of borrowing, how do we go about sustainable borrowing in terms of our larger debt burden?
My understanding is that the government has said that it is not going to borrow large amounts for project financing in the next 2-3 years until we have seen some easing up of the current debt service burden. The borrowing that we will do will be international capital market borrowing to roll over existing repayments that are coming on board. So it is not that Sri Lanka will see a ending of foreign debt settlements in 2021. It goes into 2022, 23, and then we get a break of a year or so, and then another tower has built up from 2025 onwards. We are looking essentially at a decade of very high foreign debt resettlements coming up every year. So that makes sense to say we will only borrow to roll over essential debt, and that will be mostly in the form of international sovereign bonds or foreign term deposits. Now, the demands for infrastructure spending, for other forms of capital spending means that the government still has to keep raising money for spending purposes. And my sense is that we would probably see the preference to convert loans to FDI, in a sense, from debt to equity. But the choices are very limited. I mean, there is only a handful of countries that will be sort of looking to come with infrastructure spending that they bring in as FDI rather than loans. I'm talking specifically about China, for instance. So there again, Sri Lanka will have to look at its geopolitics, its international relations. How do we manage more sort of involvement of Chinese presence in Sri Lanka in key infrastructure projects? It can be done. I think Sri Lanka has had a decade and a half of experience in now moving ahead with foreign funded development projects, and lessons have been learned about project feasibility studies, environmental studies, and prioritizing what our infrastructure requirements are and seeking funding for that on our terms.
So this would also mean that, certain state-owned enterprises, for example, might have to be privatized. Is that an option, or is that necessary?
I don't think that divestiture of state-owned enterprises is on the government's agenda. I think it will be more in the lines of restructuring, but retaining majority control, and that's 51% share in existing SOEs. So it will be there may be a push to involve public-private partnerships, but they take time to take effect. They take time to, the regulatory environment for PPPs needs to be worked out. So that will be a long-term strategy. The immediate focus, I am sure, will be more along the lines of getting FDI to come in and support some infrastructure development.
Right. Dilhan, let me move to you. One of the main kind of short-term and one of the biggest sectors that has been affected because of the current climate is the tourism sector that your companies are part of. They've faced a twin shock, one through the Easter Sunday attacks last year, and then of course the current pandemic. And with borders being closed, there is a more long-term impact potentially on the tourism sector. How does the tourism sector come out of this shock? How does it respond and develop itself? Of course, this would depend on borders being opened at some point. What can it do before borders are opened, and what can it do once borders are open to regenerate the sector?
But of course, the options are limited, Kithmina, but as most are doing at this point, they're looking to the domestic market, but that is limited because there is an abundance of capacity, especially at the premium end. So we are reaching out to the local market, but that really doesn't help the main engine of growth in tourism, which is the smaller and the micro and small enterprise. So I think it's a time for building. We need to be able to focus on our training, which is what we're doing. We're doing our maintenance. We are getting our methods right. And as there was a nice term that I read in a report recently, we are trying to build so that we can achieve escape velocity, which was a nice term, because what we are trying to do is to respond to this crisis as positively as possible by refining our processes, refining our product, engaging our consumers in spite of the fact that we can't receive them. So we're looking at digital methods, we're looking at PR, etc. And my brother is involved with several national initiatives. And I think there you have seen some really fantastic collaboration, ultimately to be able to strengthen the collaboration amongst stakeholders in the tourism industry. And I have no doubt that there is enormous pent-up demand. We have seen that happening in New Zealand, in China to an extent. And when that happens, Sri Lanka must be ready. And that's what we are gearing towards.
Since you brought up New Zealand, so New Zealand and Australia have now created what is called a tourism bubble, where you can travel between the two countries. Also, that's parts of Australia. New Zealand and Singapore, I think, are also in negotiations of expanding this. If, for example, we are able to contain community spread in Sri Lanka, and unfortunately, we were on track until last week in that, is that one option that the tourism sector can pursue. Of course, this is dependent on the ground situation in regards to the pandemic.
I think there are two dimensions to that, Kithmina. Of course, at a practical level, yes, it should be possible. There are certain countries that have extremely stringent measures, but there is also the diplomatic angle where Sri Lanka, as a relatively small nation, would perhaps not find it palatable to be banning certain countries and accepting others. It could be viewed in a different perspective. But also the fact is that we saw the rapidity and the ferocity of the of COVID's return. And I think whilst we have really good measures in place, we need to be extremely cautious. So I think it's a little premature. We need to deal with this situation. And as we deal with this in the coming days, I think we'll be demonstrating our ability to handle a wider incident than what we had at the outset. We've really demonstrated or seen the resilience and capability of our healthcare system, which has been amazing. And as we get over this, I absolutely agree that there is a possibility, possibly not to create a national bubble, but to create localized bubbles, which I think is one of the proposals that the tourist industry is discussing with the government.
Dr. Nisha, the tourism sector is one of the sectors that has a high amount of informal sector workers. And one of the statistics in our report is that only 29% of our workforce is covered by our social protection mechanisms. So when a sector such as tourism is affected in the way that it has, this also affects how social protection mechanisms come into play. How resilient are our social protection mechanisms right now? What needs to be done to ensure that particularly informal sector workers in the country are covered under a situation like this?
So actually, at the moment, the informal sector workers are not covered at all. So government relief effort was first given to the Samurdhi recipient, those are the poor, and then it was extended to the informal sector workers, because at the moment there is no social, there are few social protection programs, the farmers one, but those are looking at pensions. But this kind of situation, when there are economic downturns and when the economic activities are slowed down, there is nothing to protect those workers. So in other countries, this is partly because in Sri Lanka, the social protection given to workers are linked to the employer. So formal sector the workers get protection through their employers. But even that at the moment is very difficult because the firms are themselves struggling, and because of the laws in the country, they have to retain their workers, but it's a difficult situation. So I think in the long run, we need to really think about having an independent entity which can provide social protection in times of this. And like what Dilhan Fernando was studying, this is the time for reskilling workers and getting them prepared for the future. But at the moment, we are not doing that because we are not geared for doing that. Because in other countries, there are unemployment insurance. Along with that, there are reskilling programs where workers have income protection, and then they can improve their skills and productivity. So I think really the country really needs to look at improving social protection to cover, because we have 68% workers in the informal sector, to cover those workers so that we are more resilient.
I've been informed that we need to start wrapping up because we're almost out of time. So Dr. Nisha, let me come to you first. What would be your three main takeaways looking at the next, let's say, 3-year time period? In terms of policy, what are the three policy as well as the state of the economy? What are your three big takeaways that you would like to highlight that both the government as well as the private sector, as all of the stakeholders should take note of?
So what we have experienced in 2019 and 2020 is these disasters happen. We can't stop them from happening. That is beyond us. What we can do is be better prepared so that we respond to them better, and then we recover from them better. And the costs of these disasters are minimized. So that is one thing. The other thing is we can be better prepared to manage this risk. I mean, the good example is the health sector right now in Sri Lanka. I mean, they were well prepared and they could manage because, you know, we have a well-established health system. We need an integrated disaster risk system for all the other sectors. Third thing is social protection. We need to, as I was talking earlier, we need to improve our social protection so that when these disasters happen, we don't fall back on our human development and we can recover fast.
Dilhan, let me come to you. What are your three, from the private sector perspective, what do you think are the three big takeaways that need to be kind of highlighted at this point in time?
I would say the first is to look at a redefinition of our value system. If you look at natural resources, we need to ascribe certain value to the fact that ecosystem services provide us with the air that we breathe, the trees, the Singaraja forest, all these incredible assets that we have. I think we also need to ascribe value to things like the fact that there are a lot of people, increasing number of people in our society who suffer from loneliness. There is a cost to that, but equally, we need to review the fact whether education, healthcare, and so on, whether they really are costs, whether they are costs or whether we balance those with value. So I think really a framework for value based on some of the principles that we see from Dr. Mazzucato, but beyond that, also to look at the value that there is unlocked, that could be unlocked in our economy. Secondly, it would be in terms of innovation, to bring together, to sort of maybe address the digital divide, to be able to give our farmers access to some of the technologies that today, you know, a while ago we used to think that technology, this adoption of technology, research, development, innovation, it was a competitive advantage. It's not anymore. It's today, it's a basic prerequisite for doing business, of course, with market, with value addition and so on. So finally, it would be about building back better. We've heard that term, but I think building back better means building back greener. It also means building back bottom up, because the poor, as the report highlights beautifully, poor are worst affected. So ultimately, I would say we need to strengthen the foundations of our economy. And to do that, we have to redefine our roles, as we discussed, as a business, as government, as academia, and so on.
Dr. Dushni, you have the final word amongst the panelists. What would you think are the three big takeaways?
So I'm going to come back to where we started, and that's fiscal policy. To me, we have to look at the tax and spending policies to put our public finances in shape. Otherwise, as Nisha said and as Dilhan said, we are not going to build back better, because each time a shock of this nature hits us, we are going to be, you know, it's one step forward and two steps backwards. So we need to have better fiscal resources at hand to meet these kinds of crises, and that requires some attention over the next 3 years. I don't think it can be done immediately, but we need to start thinking about it. Second is, I mentioned also that, you know, Sri Lanka needs to build sort of firewalls to ensure that we are not vulnerable to these kinds of external shocks. We have taken on debt that leaves us exposed to shocks for the next decade. And that means we need to look at how we can show up foreign reserves, not borrowed, but non-borrowed foreign reserves. And that brings me to my third point, and that again, I think the fiscal and monetary measures, the import restrictions, the restrictions on capital outflows, etc., that we've implemented have to be seen as necessary short-term emergency measures. But beyond the recovery period, I think we have to look at how we can attract foreign direct investment into technology-driven, high-value manufacturing and services sector to ensure that we earn foreign exchange earnings and keep our eye on what's happening in the global economy and be able to be agile enough to link up to those kinds of networks, supply networks, as they reform and re-energize themselves.
Sorry, I know I said last question to you, but I'm going to ask a follow-up at that point. What do we need to do to attract more foreign direct investment to Sri Lanka? I think that's the key question at this point.
Well, I think it depends what kind of foreign direct investment that we are talking about. There is strategic foreign direct investment that will come to Sri Lanka without us having to do very much, because the investors see something from their own interest. They see a reason to come here. And I think over the last decade or so, a lot of FDI that we've seen is strategic FDI. But what we want is foreign direct investment that comes into manufacturing, into services sector, to bring the technology transfer, the knowledge transfer. There we have not been as successful. To get there, we have an advantage. I think we can say that there is a period of assured political stability in this country. What we need now is to take advantage of the health, early start that we got on the health front, on the recovery, and build on that through some policy rethinking of where we want to be in 5 years' time and how to get there. The policy environment there will be critical to get that kind of FDI.
All right. On that note, I would like to thank all three of you for taking part in this webinar. Dr. Dushni Weerakoon, Mr. Dilhan Fernando, and Dr. Nisha Arunatilake for their valuable contributions. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to our audience who have joined us on Facebook and have sent a lot of comments and have sent quite a few questions as well. I tried integrating all your questions into a broader question because we have allocated only 1 hour for this discussion. I would like to remind you that the IPS State of the Economy Report 2020, Pandemics and Disruptions, Reviving Sri Lanka's Economy, is now available through IPS. So if you want to purchase it, you can contact our publications officer, Mr. Amesh Temnakon, or email him by emailing amesh@ips.lk. Other details will be posted on our social media platforms and our website. So please feel free to contact us and access and purchase the State of the Economy report. Thank you very much for joining us. Stay safe, wear your masks, social distance yourselves, and listen to the public health guidelines given by public health officials. Thank you very much and have a good evening.